The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban street as Mr. Thompson checked his rearview mirror for the 100th time. His teenage daughter shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat beside him, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her basketball team sweatshirt. They were only 10 minutes from home after her physical therapy session when the police cruiser's lights began flashing behind them. "Stay calm, sweetheart," Mr. Thompson said softly, pulling over to the curb with practiced precision. His daughter's anxiety was palpable. This wasn't their first traffic stop, and past experiences had left their mark. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as he taught his children to do, and took a deep breath. Through the side mirror, he watched the officer approach. Something about the way the man walked, aggressive and rushed, made Mr. Thompson's stomach tighten. 23 years in the Marine Corps had taught him to read body language, and what he saw wasn't good. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked, shining his flashlight directly into the car despite the daylight. His nameplate read Officer Reynolds, and his hand was already resting on his holster. License and registration. Mr. Thompson moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements clear and visible as he reached for his documents. "Of course, officer. May I ask why we're being stopped?" The officer ignored the question, snatching the papers from Mr. Thompson's steady hand. His flashlight beam swept across the interior, pausing on his daughter's legs. The girl tried to pull her basketball shorts lower, a self-conscious gesture she developed since getting her prosthetics. "Both of you, out of the vehicle," Officer Reynolds demanded, his voice sharp enough to make nearby birds scatter from a telephone wire. "Sir," Mr. Thompson began, maintaining his composure, "my daughter has prosthetic legs. It takes her a moment to—" "I set out." The officer cut him off, swinging his car door open wider. "Now." More patrol cars were pulling up, their lights painting the peaceful suburban street in alternating red and blue. Neighbors began appearing on their porches, phones in hand, drawn by the commotion in their usually quiet neighborhood. Mr. Thompson's daughter looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She'd been through so much already. Learning to walk again after the accident, dealing with stares and whispers at school, fighting every day to be treated like any other teenager. Now this. "It's okay, baby," he whispered, giving her a reassuring nod. But inside, his military training was kicking in, assessing the situation, planning contingencies. Something was very wrong here, and he could feel it in his bones that the next few minutes would change everything. The sun dipped lower behind the houses, and a cool breeze rustled through nearby trees. What should have been a peaceful evening was about to become anything but, as Officer Reynolds racked his knuckles aggressively against the passenger window, making Mr. Thompson's daughter jump in her seat. More neighbors gathered on their lawns, their presence both a comfort and a concern. Mr. Thompson knew that whatever happened next would have witnesses, and somehow that felt both reassuring and absolutely necessary. As he reached to unlock his door, he silently prayed that his years of military discipline would help him navigate what was quickly becoming a parent's worst nightmare. As Mr. Thompson carefully stepped out of the car, the evening air felt heavy with tension. His daughter remained in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the door handle, unsure of what to do. Officer Reynolds had already called for backup. 3 more patrol cars now lined the street, their lights flooding the neighborhood in rhythmic flashes of red and blue. "I said both of you out," Officer Reynolds shouted, moving toward the passenger side. His hand still hadn't left his holster, a detail that wasn't lost on Mr. Thompson or the growing crowd of onlookers. "Sir, please," Mr. Thompson said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "My daughter needs a moment to adjust her prosthetics. If you'll allow me to help her." "You stay where you are." The officer's voice cracked with an edge of something that seemed more like prejudice than protocol. "Young lady, open this door right now." Mr. Thompson's daughter rolled down her window instead, her voice trembling but clear. "Officer, I have prosthetic legs. I just need a minute to." That's exactly what concerns me, Officer Reynolds cut in, his flashlight beam focusing intensely on her legs. For all I know, you could be hiding anything in there. Out. Now. The gathered neighbors murmured in disbelief. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Another voiced, "This isn't right." Phones were raised higher, recording everything. A middle-aged woman in medical scrubs stepped forward from her porch. "I'm a nurse at County General," she called out. "That girl is my patient. Those are legitimate prosthetics." Officer Reynolds ignored her, yanking open the passenger door. The sudden movement made Mr. Thompson's daughter flinch, and she instinctively tried to protect her legs with her hands. "Don't touch her." Mr. Thompson's voice carried the weight of years of military command, though he hadn't raised it. "Officer, I'm requesting your supervisor immediately." More neighbors had gathered now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. A mail carrier stopped his truck, leaving it running as he watched. The community's collective tension was building like a thunderstorm about to break. "You don't make demands here," Officer Reynolds snapped, but something in Mr. Thompson's bearing made him hesitate. "Show me some ID." "My wallet is still in the car, which you ordered me away from," Mr. Thompson replied evenly. "But in my back pocket, you'll find my military ID. 23 years of service. Master Surgeon, retired. And I'm telling you now, what you're doing is wrong." Officer Reynolds' hand finally left his holster, but his aggressive stance remained. "Military ID? Sure, anyone can get those these days. Probably fake, just like." "Like what, Officer Reynolds?" Mr. Thompson's question hung in the air, daring the officer to finish his thought. "Like my daughter's medical condition. Like my service to this country. Please complete that sentence." The gathering crowd had grown silent, watching the exchange with held breath. In the distance, another siren wailed. This one different, likely the supervisor Mr. Thompson had requested. A breeze stirred the leaves of the maple trees lining the street, their shadows dancing across the pavement like nervous witnesses. Mr. Thompson's daughter sat frozen in her seat, one hand still on her prosthetic, the other gripping her phone. She'd been through countless medical procedures, years of physical therapy, and more stares than she could count, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The approaching siren grew louder, and Officer Reynolds' jaw clenched visibly. He'd started something he couldn't finish, and everyone watching knew it. The next few moments would either escalate into something unthinkable or diffuse into what it should have been all along: a simple traffic stop. Everything hinged on what happened next. Before the supervisor's car could arrive, Officer Reynolds made a decision that would haunt his career. He reached into the car and grabbed Mr. Thompson's daughter's prosthetic leg. The crowd gasped collectively, and several phones shifted position to get a better angle of the unfolding scene. "What's this compartment here?" Officer Reynolds demanded, his fingers searching for non-existent seams along the prosthetic's smooth surface. This could be hiding anything. Mr. Thompson's daughter burst into tears, trying desperately to maintain her balance in the car seat with only one prosthetic leg. "Dad," she cried out, her voice breaking with fear and humiliation. The sound of his daughter's distress hit Mr. Thompson like a physical blow. In all his years of military service, through deployments and firefights, he'd never felt rage quite like this. But his training took over, not the combat training, but the countless hours of diplomatic missions, of de-escalating tense situations in foreign villages. "Officer Reynolds," Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the evening air, steady as steel. "I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen carefully." He took one measured step forward, his hands still visible at his sides. "That prosthetic leg you're holding, it's not evidence. It's not contraband. It's my daughter's mobility. It's her independence. It's her dignity." The nurse from next door had edged closer, her phone steady in her hands as she recorded. "That's a Ottobock prosthetic," she called out. "I was there when she was fitted for it. There are no compartments, just medical engineering that lets her walk. Officer Reynolds glanced down at the prosthetic in his hands, then at the crying teenager trying to stay upright in her car seat. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. "You have exactly 3 seconds to return my daughter's prosthetic leg," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice carrying the weight of command without raising its volume. "Then you're going to step back and wait for your supervisor, who I hear arriving right now." The supervisor's car turned the corner, its lights painting new shadows across the scene. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, still holding the prosthetic, as if the reality of his actions was finally sinking in. 1, Mr. Thompson counted, calm and clear. A few neighbors had moved closer to Mr. Thompson's daughter, offering silent support. An elderly man with a veteran's cap had tears in his eyes as he watched. 2. The prosthetic trembled slightly in Officer Reynolds' grip. The approaching supervisor's car door slammed shut. Before Mr. Thompson could say 3, Officer Reynolds moved forward awkwardly, trying to return the prosthetic leg without actually having to face his victim. But Mr. Thompson stepped between him and the car. "No," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "You look my daughter in the eye. You return what's hers, and you apologize." The supervisor was walking briskly toward them now, taking in the scene, the crying teenager, the crowd with their phones, the prosthetic leg in his officer's hands. Officer Reynolds finally met the girl's eyes. In them, he saw not the threat he imagined, but a scared teenager who'd already overcome more challenges than most adults. His hands shook as he carefully returned the prosthetic. I'm sorry," he managed to say, the words coming out barely above a whisper. The supervisor had reached them now, her face a mask of professional concern masking obvious anger. "Officer Reynolds, step away from the vehicle immediately." She turned to Mr. Thompson and his daughter. "I'm Lieutenant Chen. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what happened here." The tension in the air began to shift, not disappearing, but transforming into something else. A shared witness to both injustice and dignity, to prejudice and its confrontation, to a father's love and a community's solidarity. Lieutenant Chen's arrival had changed the atmosphere completely. The flashing lights from the police cars still painted the street in red and blue, but now they seemed to highlight a different kind of scene, one of accountability rather than confrontation. Mr. Thompson stood straight and tall, his military bearing unmistakable as he pulled out his ID. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice carrying across the now quiet street, "I'm a retired master surgeon, United States Marine Corps. 23 years of service, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Bronze Star." He paused, letting that sink in. "But none of those matter right now. What matters is that your officer just violated my daughter's civil rights and basic human dignity." The lieutenant studied the military ID carefully, then looked at Officer Reynolds, who seemed to be shrinking into himself with each passing moment. "Master Surgeon," she said, "I'd like to hear exactly what happened here." Mr. Thompson's daughter had managed to reattach her prosthetic with help from the nurse neighbor, who stood protectively beside her car door. The teenager wiped her tears but held her head high, showing a strength that made her father's heart swell with pride even in this difficult moment. "My daughter and I were returning from her physical therapy session," Mr. Thompson explained, his voice steady. "Officer Reynolds pulled us over, no reason given. Then he escalated the situation by demanding we exit the vehicle without consideration for my daughter's disability. When she tried to explain about her prosthetics, Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. He forcibly removed one of her prosthetic legs, claiming it might contain contraband. The gathered neighbors murmured in agreement, several holding up their phones to indicate they had video evidence. The nurse stepped forward. "I have the whole thing recorded, Lieutenant, including the part where I identified myself as her healthcare provider and confirmed the legitimacy of her prosthetics." Lieutenant Chen's expression darkened as she turned to Officer Reynolds. "Is this accurate?" Officer Reynolds opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at the ground. His silence was answer enough. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice taking on the tone he'd used during military briefings. Lieutenant, I've served this country for over 2 decades. I've trained soldiers, led missions, and worked with local law enforcement in cities across America. What I witnessed today isn't just poor policing. It's a fundamental failure to protect and serve. The elderly veteran in the crowd called out, "Tell her about the Foundation, Sergeant." Mr. Thompson gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "I run a support group for veterans with disabilities," he explained. "We work with local communities to improve understanding and accessibility. I never thought I'd see my own daughter." He paused, emotion finally cracking through his professional demeanor. No parent should have to watch their child be humiliated like this. No person with a disability should face this kind of treatment from those sworn to protect them. His daughter reached out and squeezed his hand, their shared strength visible to everyone watching. The simple gesture seemed to say more about dignity and resilience than any words could. Lieutenant Chen pulled out her notebook. "Master Sergeant, I want to take your full statement. This incident will be thoroughly investigated." She glanced at the crowd with their phones. "And I assume we'll have plenty of video evidence to review." "Yes, ma'am," Mr. Thompson replied. "But I want more than an investigation. I want change. Real change. This needs to be a wake-up call about how law enforcement interacts with people with disabilities, especially in communities of color." The evening had deepened around them, but porch lights were clicking on up and down the street, as if the whole neighborhood was standing witness. In that moment, surrounded by supportive neighbors and facing down injustice with dignity, Mr. Thompson's military training merged perfectly with his role as a father, protecting not just his daughter, but potentially countless others who might face similar situations. The mood shifted dramatically as Officer Reynolds stood there, his earlier aggression completely deflated. The weight of his actions seemed to physically press down on his shoulders as Lieutenant Chen reviewed the footage on a neighbor's phone. Each swipe of her finger revealed another angle of the incident, and with each viewing, her expression grew more severe. "Play that part again," she requested, watching the moment when Officer Reynolds had grabbed the prosthetic leg. The neighbor obliged, and several other residents stepped forward, offering their own recordings. "I've seen enough," she finally said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Mr. Thompson's daughter had regained her composure, though she stayed close to her father's side. The nurse who had spoken up earlier was showing her something on her phone, a message that had already started circulating on local community groups about what had happened. "Master Sergeant," Lieutenant Chen addressed Mr. Thompson, "I want you to know that this isn't what our department stands for. What happened here?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't just a policy violation. This is a fundamental breach of trust with our community." Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his face now pale under the streetlights. The crowd watched as Lieutenant Chen turned to face him. "Officer Reynolds, surrender your badge and weapon. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." A collective murmur ran through the gathering. Someone whispered, "About time." But Mr. Thompson raised his hand slightly, and the crowd fell silent again. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice measured, "suspension isn't enough. We need real change. My daughter isn't the first person with a disability to face this kind of treatment, and unless something changes, she won't be the last." The elderly veteran who had been watching stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "I was a police officer for 30 years before retiring," he announced. "Never in my career did we treat people this way. This young officer needs more than suspension. He needs education." Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement. "I have a proposal," he said, looking directly at Lieutenant Chen. "Your department needs comprehensive training on interacting with people with disabilities. My foundation can help with that. We have veterans, healthcare professionals, and community advocates who can share their experiences." Lieutenant Chen looked thoughtful. You're right. This incident highlights a serious gap in our training. She turned to address the crowd. I want everyone here to know that your videos and statements will be crucial to our internal investigation. But more importantly, they're going to help us make sure nothing like this happens again. The nurse who had been standing with Mr. Thompson's daughter spoke up again. I work with patients with prosthetics every day. They already face so many challenges. The last thing they need is to fear the police. As if on cue, more neighbors began sharing their own stories. Of family members with disabilities, of friends who'd faced discrimination, of fears they'd never voiced before. What had started as a terrible incident was transforming into something else. A moment of community unity and potential change. Mr. Thompson's daughter, watching all this unfold, finally spoke up. Her voice was quiet but clear. Dad, maybe we could invite Officer Reynolds to one of your foundation's meetings. Let him meet other people with prosthetics, hear their stories. The crowd fell silent, amazed at the young girl's capacity for understanding even after what she just endured. Mr. Thompson looked at his daughter with pride, then at Officer Reynolds, who had tears in his eyes. That's exactly the kind of change we need, Mr. Thompson said softly. Not just punishment, but education, understanding, growth. The street lights had fully taken over from the setting sun now, casting a warm glow over the scene. What had started as a frightening traffic stop was ending as something entirely different. A teaching moment, a catalyst for change, and a testament to the power of standing up for what's right with dignity rather than hatred. Word of what happened spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. A local news reporter, who lived just 3 blocks away, had arrived with her phone already recording. She'd caught the tail end of the confrontation and was now interviewing neighbors who had witnessed the whole thing. I've never seen anything like it, said the elderly veteran, speaking into the reporter's phone. That father showed more restraint and dignity than anyone could expect. And his daughter. He paused, wiping his eyes. That young lady's strength, that's what America should be about. The nurse was sharing the medical facts about prosthetics with a small group of neighbors, explaining how they worked and why Officer Reynolds' actions were not just discriminatory, but potentially dangerous. These aren't toys, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of professional concern. They're precisely fitted medical devices. Mishandling them can cause serious problems for the user. Mr. Thompson's daughter had become the center of quiet support from several teenage neighbors who had come outside with their parents. One girl admitted she was on the same basketball team, but had never known of the prosthetics. You're always so fast on the court, she said, genuine admiration in her voice. I had no idea. The local news reporter approached Mr. Thompson carefully. Sir, would you be willing to share your story? People need to hear this. She gestured to the gathered crowd, the suspended officers still standing with Lieutenant Chen, the community coming together. This isn't just about one incident. This is about change. Mr. Thompson looked at his daughter, silently asking her permission. She nodded, standing a little straighter. Yes, he said to the reporter. But this story isn't about anger or revenge. It's about education, understanding, and making sure this never happens to anyone else. The reporter nodded, understanding exactly what kind of story this needed to be. She started her recording. Tonight, what could have been a tragic confrontation became a powerful moment of community unity and potential change, thanks to the dignity and wisdom of a local veteran father and his remarkable daughter. As she interviewed them, more people arrived. A city council member who lived nearby had heard what happened and came to offer support. Parents of other children with disabilities began showing up, drawn by messages spreading through community groups. Your daughter's story needs to be heard, one mother said, her own child watching from a wheelchair. We've been afraid to speak up for so long. The nurse who had recorded everything was helping other neighbors upload their videos to a shared folder. Documentation matters, she explained. This isn't about shaming anyone. It's about proving the need for change. Lieutenant Chen, who had been making calls to her superiors, returned to speak with Mr. Thompson. "The chief wants to meet with you tomorrow," she said. "He's taking this very seriously. Would you be willing to work with us on developing new training protocols?" The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those who remained were no longer just spectators. They were writing down their contact information, offering to help with Mr. Thompson's foundation, asking how they could support better training for police officers. "Look at this," Mr. Thompson said quietly to his daughter, gesturing at the impromptu community gathering. "You see how much good can come from standing up for what's right." His daughter watched as a group of neighbors exchanged phone numbers, planning a community meeting about disability awareness. "Dad," she said thoughtfully, "I think this is bigger than us now." The reporter, who had been capturing these quiet moments, smiled behind her phone. She knew that sometimes the most powerful stories weren't about the initial conflict, but about what happens when people choose to transform a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light. As the evening continued, what had started as a frightening traffic stop had become something none of them could have predicted: the beginning of real change, sparked by a father's dignity and a daughter's courage, witnessed and supported by an entire community ready to stand up for what was right. The next morning, the police chief's office was unusually busy. The videos from the previous evening had reached his desk before dawn, and he'd spent the early hours reviewing each one multiple times. Now, sitting across from Mr. Thompson and his daughter, the chief's face showed the weight of what he'd witnessed. First, the chief began, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I want to apologize to both of you. What happened last night was completely unacceptable." He looked directly at Mr. Thompson's daughter. "Young lady, no one should ever experience what you went through." The teenager sat tall in her chair, her prosthetic legs now a symbol of strength rather than vulnerability. The morning sunlight streaming through the office windows caught the medals on her father's jacket. He'd chosen to wear his formal military attire for this meeting. "Chief," Mr. Thompson responded, "we're not here for just an apology. We're here for action." He placed a folder on the desk between them. "These are proposals from my Foundation for Disability Awareness Training. We've been developing them for months, but after last night, it's clear they're needed now." The chief opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. His eyebrows rose as he read. "This is comprehensive," he admitted. "De-escalation techniques, medical awareness, sensitivity training." He looked up. "You had this ready." "Unfortunately," Mr. Thompson replied, "what happened to my daughter isn't unique. It's just that this time, there were witnesses. This time, people recorded it. This time, we have a chance to make real change." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Chen entered, carrying a tablet. "Sir, the body camera footage has been reviewed, and," she paused, glancing at the Thompson family, "the story has gone viral. Every local news station is covering it, and national media is picking it up too." The chief nodded grimly. "How was Officer Reynolds?" "He's requested to make a formal statement," Lieutenant Chen replied. "And he's asked to enroll in every available training course we have on disability awareness and cultural sensitivity." Mr. Thompson's daughter spoke up, her voice clear and confident. "Dad's foundation offers training by people with disabilities. We share our stories, help people understand. Maybe Officer Reynolds could start there." The chief and Lieutenant Chen exchanged surprised looks at the young girl's compassion. Her father smiled proudly. "Actually," the chief said, leaning forward, "I'd like to do more than that. Mr. Thompson, would you consider implementing your training program department-wide? Not just for Officer Reynolds, but for every officer on the force." The lieutenant added, "And if it works here, we could share it with other departments. Create a model for change." Mr. Thompson reached for his daughter's hand. "That's exactly what we hoped for. But," he paused, making sure he had everyone's attention, "the training needs to come with policy changes. Written procedures for interacting with people with disabilities. Real consequences for violations. The chief picked up his phone. "I'm calling the police commission right now. We can schedule an emergency meeting for this afternoon." He looked at Mr. Thompson's daughter. "Would you be willing to speak at the meeting? Share your experience?" She squeezed her father's hand and nodded. "Yes, people need to hear this story. Not just what happened to me, but what could happen to anyone." As they left the chief's office, they found the hallway lined with officers, many of whom had seen the videos. The officers stood respectfully as they passed, some nodding, others offering quiet words of support. It was a small gesture, but it represented something bigger, the beginning of understanding, the start of change. Outside, reporters were gathering, but they weren't just looking for a sensational story. They wanted to know about the training program, about the foundation, about how one family's dignity in the face of discrimination might help transform an entire police department's approach to serving their community. The local community center buzzed with energy as people filled every available seat. Just 3 days after the incident, what started as a neighborhood meeting had grown into something much bigger. People from all over the city had come to show support and share their own stories. Mr. Thompson stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. There were families with children who had various disabilities, veterans in wheelchairs, elderly folks with walking aids, and countless community members who simply wanted to be part of positive change. "When my daughter lost her legs in that accident 2 years ago," he began, his voice steady but emotional, "we learned that the world isn't always built for people with disabilities. But we never expected to face discrimination from those sworn to protect us." His daughter sat in the front row, surrounded by her basketball teammates who had come wearing their team jerseys to show support. Several held signs reading "Stand Up for Dignity" and "Respect All Abilities." A community organizer stepped up to share the latest developments. "The videos have been viewed millions of times," she announced. "We've received messages from disability rights groups across the country. They want to know more about Mr. Thompson's training program." The nurse who had recorded the incident stood up. "I've worked with patients with prosthetics for 15 years, she said. "What happened that night happens more often than people know. Most victims stay quiet out of fear, but not anymore." Parents began sharing their own stories. A mother described how her son with autism had been misunderstood by police during a meltdown. An elderly man talked about being roughly handled during a traffic stop because he moved too slowly with his walker. The high school basketball coach approached the microphone. "I've known this young lady for 2 years," he said, gesturing to Mr. Thompson's daughter. "She never used her prosthetics as an excuse. She worked harder than anyone. And now she's showing the same strength in standing up for others." A surprise visitor made his way to the front, Officer Reynolds, out of uniform, looking nervous but determined. The room fell silent as he took the microphone. "I came here to listen," he said simply. "I need to understand. I need to learn. What I did was wrong, and I'm here to do better." He looked directly at Mr. Thompson's daughter. "Your forgiveness and strength have taught me more than any training manual ever could." The crowd's response was thoughtful, not cheering, but respectful nods. They recognized that real change required both accountability and opportunity for growth. A local tech company CEO stood up next. "Our company wants to help," she announced. "We're offering to fund the creation of training videos featuring real stories from people with disabilities. These videos will be available free to any police department willing to use them." The elderly veteran who had witnessed the original incident shuffled to the microphone with his cane. "In my day," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "we didn't talk about these things. We suffered in silence. But watching that young lady and her father stand up with such dignity," he wiped his eyes, "that's the America I fought for." Mr. Thompson's daughter wheeled herself to the podium, her prosthetics visible beneath her basketball shorts. The room fell silent again. "I used to try to hide my prosthetics," she admitted. "I was embarrassed. But after what happened, after seeing all of you here today," she looked around the room, her voice growing stronger, "I'm not hiding anymore. None of us should have to hide who we are or live in fear. The applause that followed wasn't just supportive, it was determined. Every person in that room understood they weren't just attending a meeting, they were part of a movement. A movement born from one family's courage to stand up for dignity, and a community's decision to stand with them. 6 months later, the changes sparked by that evening traffic stop had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The police department's training room was full as Mr. Thompson led another session, but this time he wasn't alone. His daughter stood beside him, confident and strong, as she shared her story with a new group of officers. "Look around this room," Mr. Thompson said to the gathered officers. "What you see today wasn't possible half a year ago." He gestured to the diverse group of trainers, people with various disabilities, healthcare workers, and community advocates who now regularly shared their experiences with law enforcement. Officer Reynolds sat in the front row. He'd become an unexpected ally in this transformation, speaking openly about his own learning journey. "I made a terrible mistake that night," he told the group. "But thanks to this family's compassion, that mistake became a chance for all of us to do better." The training program they developed had spread to police departments in 3 neighboring states. Videos of Mr. Thompson and his daughter's story had been viewed by millions, inspiring other communities to start similar programs. But the real change could be seen in the small, daily interactions on the streets. A young officer raised her hand. "Yesterday, I had a traffic stop with a deaf driver," she shared. "Because of this training, I knew exactly how to handle it. The driver actually thanked me afterward, said it was the first time she felt truly respected during a police interaction." The nurse who had witnessed the original incident was now a regular part of the training team. She held up a prosthetic leg similar to the one that had sparked everything. "This isn't just a medical device," she explained. "It's independence. It's dignity. It's someone's life. Understanding that changes everything about how you approach your work." During breaks, Mr. Thompson's daughter could often be found chatting with officers, answering their questions about life with prosthetics. She'd grown into a powerful advocate, speaking at schools and community centers about disability rights and the importance of standing up for what's right. The City Council had recently passed new policies requiring disability awareness training for all public service workers, not just police. The foundation Mr. Thompson had started was now helping other cities develop similar programs. But the biggest change, Mr. Thompson told the officers, isn't in the policies or the training manuals. It's in the hearts and minds of people like you. It's in the way you choose to see and treat others. His daughter stepped forward. "6 months ago, I was scared and humiliated during a traffic stop. Today, I'm helping train police officers." She smiled at the group. "That's what real change looks like." As the session ended, a rookie officer approached them. "You know," she said quietly, "I almost quit the academy last year. I have a brother with cerebral palsy, and I worried about how officers might treat him." She straightened her uniform proudly. "But now, I know I can be part of making things better." Outside the training room, life in their community had changed too. People with disabilities reported feeling more confident in their interactions with law enforcement. Officers spoke about feeling better prepared and more understanding. The fear and mistrust that had existed were slowly being replaced by communication and respect. Mr. Thompson watched as his daughter demonstrated to a group of officers how her prosthetics worked. She was no longer the frightened teenager from that evening traffic stop. She had become a leader, a teacher, and an inspiration. Sometimes, he told the officers gathered around her, the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the most important changes. But it only works if we choose to transform pain into purpose, fear into understanding, and anger into action. As they packed up their training materials that evening, father and daughter shared a quiet moment. "Did you ever think," she asked, "that one terrible traffic stop would lead to all this?" He smiled, remembering the strength she'd shown that night and every day since. "No," he replied. But I always knew you had the power to change the world. Sometimes you just need the courage to stand up and the wisdom to stand strong.